So today we'll talk about asset management, assigning information ownership responsibility, develop and use information classification guidelines, understand information handling and labeling procedures, identifying and inventory information systems, create and implement asset classification. So asset management. So these are some questions you would ask for asset management. Is it possible to protect something if we do not know how much it is worth and how sensitive it is? Until we classify the information, how do we know the level of protection required? Unless we determine the value to the organization, how can we decide the amount of time, effort, or money that we should spend securing the asset? Who is responsible for making these decisions? How do we communicate the value of our information asset to our employee, business partner, and vendor? So, identification and classification of information security asset and system is essential to the proper selection of security controls to protect against the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability that we learned. So loss is the unauthorized disclosure of information. Loss of integrity is unauthorized or unintentional modification or destruction of information. Loss of availability is the accidental or intentional disruption of access to the use of information or informational systems. So we've got some definition. So this chapter kind of looks at the various methods and rating methodologies that are used to define inventory and classify information and security systems. So it looks into the public and private sector, determines who is responsible for these activities. So this is one of the ISOs and NIST guidance. So it involves mapping types of information and information system to security categories, guideline to media sanitations. So what is information security and why do we need to protect it? So it's information asset. So it's a definite piece of information stored in any manner that has some kind of value to the organization. So it could be raw, mined, developed, or purchased data or purchased data. So if the information is damaged, stolen, so it could result in a lot of other consequences, as you see here. So data stores or warehouse of information about customers. So it stores all kinds of, personal production information, sales, marketing. So it could also have intellectual property, drawings, schematic, patents. So for operational and support procedures, research documentation, and so forth. So information system provides a way and a place to process, store, and transmit and to communicate this information. So you've got a combination of hardware and software that are used, different technical aspects that are offered. So a variety of systems, customized systems. So the location could be on site or contracted to the data center. So a lot of our data these days are in the cloud. Even the phone that you have, a lot of that data is on the cloud. Sorry about that. Who is responsible for the information asset? So the owner. So it's got an assigned owner. So information security program is related to a defined relationship between the data owner and the information. So basically, the data owner is in charge of that information. So the data owner also functions as the security championship to ensure the goals of the CIA, as we learned. So your medical record that you have, we all have medical records. So the clinicians use this in their office. So are you the owner? So you're not necessarily the owner. The medical staff that uses that information is not necessarily the owner either. They're not the owner. So the information owner, the person who's responsible for protecting that information, your medical record. So in a small medical practice, that could be the physician. In a large hospital setting, so that could be management, senior management. So the owner roles, the owners have different kinds of roles that they have. Defining the asset, assigning value to the asset, level of protection, who should have access to the asset. So day-to-day security and operational tasks, ongoing governance. So we move on to the role of the information security officer. So the information owner is accountable for protection of the information asset. So the information custodian is kind of the day-to-day controls. So the information security officer provides direction and guidance, the appropriate controls. So the information owner and custodians focus on specific information asset. So these are kind of the policies, example policy, information ownership policy statement, what it includes. Information classification, the objective of an information classification system is to differentiate data, the value of the information, the natural outcome of the classification procedure, and so forth. So classification systems have their genesis in two seminal security models that were designed by the U.S. military. So that the Bell, Lapula, and the BIBA, these are kind of different classification systems. So these are kind of based on the assumption that an information security may contain information that require different levels of security, and the users of various clearance level would be accessing the information system. So you've heard of military using the they still use it for their clearance level. So here in the Bell Lapula model is to ensure the confidentiality by restricting read access to data above what a user has permission to read, and to restrict write access to the data at the level below. So a lot of these have existed before that we kind of put towards electronics now. So kind of how this is designed, you can see from top secret, secret to confidential. So this one is more of the data, the BIBA is more of the data integrity model that restricts users from reading data at the lower level and writing information to the higher level. So the theory here is that the data at the lower level may be incomplete or inaccurate, and if read could influence what is written at the higher level. So this is kind of no read down, no write up type of, so this picture kind of shows how they work. So no write up, no read down, no read up, no write down. So these type of classification systems are used in the private sector now. So a financial institute will allow a teller to view general account information and cash check a reasonable amount. So a lot of times when you'll see you go to a teller and they kind of say, oh, I've only have this limit. If you have a big check, they need access to deposit that check. So there are also view restrictions and so forth. So a financial institution will allow a teller to view account information, cash check a reasonable amount. The same teller is not allowed to view information about internal bank assets, and most definitely cannot access a system that would allow her to transfer millions of dollars, so forth. So they've got these restrictions that are held. So a hospital will allow a lab technician to access patient demographic and physician instruction, will not allow him or her to read or edit the complete patient record. So that's for security measure that's built in. So here's a life cycle process example. One of the Freedom of Information Act policy. So things you can look over. So how does the federal government classify data? So the United States government has an enormous amount of data and has vested responsibility to protecting the CIA of the information and information system. So federal guidance require the federal agency categorize information and information system. So one of the FIPS 199 requires that information owner classify information system as low, moderate. So there's different classification systems that are established here. So you've got your low, moderate, and high potential impacts, what it could happen. So you can look over these, what consequences you could have, limited to high adverse effects. So some guidelines that the federal agencies should consider. So how can malicious adversaries use unauthorized disclosure and so forth? How can malicious adversaries use unauthorized disclosure of information to gain control of agency assets? Would unauthorized disclosure, dissemination of elements of the information violate laws and so forth? So kind of looking at different aspects that may affect. So harming agencies, how can they have different questionnaires that are used? Do they violate laws? Some examples here. So how does the national security information classify it differently? So there's a military process, and so everyone that interacts with these documents recognizes that it's related to national security. Top secret. So these have been in the news recently, actually. So where former government agencies took top secret documents home. So top secret, any information or material that unauthorized disclosure, which reasonably could be expected to cause exceptional grave damage to the national security. So we've seen some examples recently in the news within the past year or so, and this includes armed damage, include armed hostiles against the United States, foreign relation documents, and so forth. So secret, any information or material that unauthorized disclosure of which reasonably could be expected to cause serious damage to the national security. So we've seen also these documents as secret and top secret that we've seen in the news within the past year, 2022 and 2023, that it could have an impact on national security. Confidential, any information or material that unauthorized disclosure which reasonably could be expected to cause damage to the national security. So we've seen these documents also as well. Unclassified, any information that can generally be distributed to the public without any threat to national security. So you'll see older top secret documents that are declassified or unclassified. You can see these. Sensitive but classified. So this classification, a Department of Defense subcategory that's applied to any information which the law's misuse or unauthorized access to or modification might adversely affect the United States. So they're sensitive, but they're unclassified. So who makes these decisions? So who decides how national security data is classified? So the national security data is classified in one of two ways. So original classification, initial determination that information requires protection. So U.S. government officials who have been trained in classification have authority to make the classification. So there's officials, committees, and so forth. Original classification authority issues security classification guides that others use in making derivative classification decision. So there's a committee decision that is made. Um, so derivative classification, the act of classification, is a specific term of information or material based on the original classification decision already made by authorized original classification authority. So the source of authority for derivation classification consists of previously classified documents or classification guide issued by an original classification authority. So how does the private sector classify? So the private sector doesn't have the legally mandated data classifications. So they may develop their own, like it says, they're free to develop a classification system appropriate to their own organization, but they can use guidelines, legally protected, confidential, internal use, and public. So they can use guidelines. So protected data that is protected by law regulation. So these are non-public personal information, confidential, so data that is essential to the mission of the organization. So business strategy, financial position, employee records, things like that. Internal use data that is necessary to conduct ordinary company business. So policy document, policy manual, non-sensitive client or vendor information, employee list, and so forth. Public, so information that's intended for the public. So annual reports, documents that are released, product documents, trade shows, papers, and things like that. Some examples here. Non-public personal information, so you don't want these information released. So these information can be reclassified or declassified the same way. Auto industry, if they have something that's a new design that's coming out, or that would be classified, but once it comes out, they can declassify those documents and relate. So downgrading sensitive level, so declassifying. Labeling and handling standards. So how information could be stored, communicated, transmitted, accessed, and so forth. Why handling standards? So information needs to be handled and accurate with classification. So even the private sector may not have, they can adopt different procedures and use different kinds of standards. So handling standards that can be used, so inform custodians and user how to treat the information, so kind of using it as your basis. So there's different standards that can be used and utilized. So I mean, so they may not have the up-to-date inventory, but they can adapt those. So what should be inventory? So putting together a comprehensive physical inventory information system. It's kind of a major task to put all this together. So you know what you're trying to protect. So you've got your hardware assets, computer equipment, printer, communication network, storage media, infrastructure, operational system software, product software, application software. So asset inventory classification attributes. Each asset should have a unique identifier. So kind of like all universities have their unique identifiers to laptops that they issue out and so forth. So assets should indicate what the asset is used for. So they got categories and subcategories, what they're used for. So software should be recorded by publisher, developer, version number, revision, and so forth. So the controlling entity is a department or business that purchased or paid for that asset. So you should also properly remove or destroy that asset. So I know, like the analytics team, healthcare for the state government, they borrow data which could be sent over on a disk, a CD disk, and could be used over time. They're responsible for destroying that information at the end of that contract. So they need to, or even physical hard drives, how they destroyed and so forth. So documentation should be maintained. So anytime an audit will account for location and position of every piece of equipment or information. So audit, has to be done to show that equipment was destroyed. So if company property needs to move from an assigned location or be destroyed, there should be an asset management procedure. I remember that how one of my students told me how they destroyed hard drive, that it had to have a hole through the middle to ensure that that hard drive was destroyed. So kind of some of the other procedures and policies you can see in the book. So I'll end it here. Let me know if you have any questions.